quite right.
You don't have to agree with them.
It has nothing to do with climate.
You have to see their point of view.
It's just too much to handle.
To understand how they came to believe what they believe.
I see you son of a bitch, Sheriff. I'm still here.
I still don't remember how I got home.
I was just praying the whole time because I thought, is this the way it's all going to end? Florida just kind of broke off.
Climate change is indeed caused by mankind.
It comes back and haunts you.
And that's difficult.
Your integrity is so important.
Of course, everybody's wandering around like zombies.
But doctors thought they were little gods.
They're the ones who are going to have to deal with the crap we leave behind.
People were crying.
It was sobering to know how powerful that storm could be.
I can't talk about that. Not only we have all the damage of the tornado, and then we had a flood right on top of it at the same time.
As the 11:30 tornado swept through northwestern Clay County, another tragedy was unfolding 70 miles to the southwest, 1.5 miles north of Ellsworth in Ellsworth County. On Highway K-14, flooding began to cover low spots of the pavement as Mr. and Mrs. Herman Meir were trying to make it back home to Lincoln, Kansas after a family gathering in Ellsworth. After another 6 inches fell, this small drainage spot turned into a torrent, and several vehicles were stopped there, one even becoming stuck in a newly formed sandbar. The car and driver, an Ellsworth hospital nurse, were pulled from the mud, but the Myers' car had driven into the water. They got out to escape, but were washed away to the west. Their bodies were found the next morning. Mrs. Meir, 51, near the car some 50 feet in a field, and Herman, 56, was 800 feet downstream in a corral where some longhorn cattle had survived. The Meir couple would be the last killed in that 70s storm, but the storms remained tornadic through the night. Alan D. Pearson, director of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center, called this thousands-of-mile-long system unusual and likened it to a dying snake.
Big old long snake.
Which was held between two high-pressure systems. It kept sending wiggles of energy north, but each wiggle was weaker than the last. The huge downpours of rain following the tornadoes made a mockery of cleanup attempts across much of Kansas and southeastern Nebraska. It had rained every day for a week. The National Weather Service predicted 18 rivers and streams in Kansas would flood. Trees, brush, and other debris carried on the floods was creating log jams on many bridges, forcing crews to add log jam control to the list of demands. Here at the Big Blue River Bridge at Marietta, a farm couple just west of the log jam there heard the bridge start to buckle under the pressure and looked to see the entire 140-foot span collapse into the rushing river. This limestone wall and some bent steel still commemorate that moment today. The Republican River at Clay Center, along with Hunter's Creek on the west side of town, were also flooding large parts of farmland, even as utility crews endured long, sleepless days of trying to restore service in the constant rain. Tornado damage there was estimated at $7.6 million by the American Insurance Association. In the Tri-Rivers area, as it is known, the third river is called the Solomon. and this was flooding at Niles at a level just 3 feet shy of the record flood of 1951, a record which held until 1993. The Great Flood of 1993 was called a once-in-500-years flood and affected much of the plains and Midwestern states. Half of tiny New Cambria was under 3 feet of water from both the Saline and Smoky Hill rivers. All roads in or out were flooded. By the weekend, most of the town's 155 residents had been evacuated, most riding on a 5-ton National Guard dump truck. But 39 stayed there to begin cleanup from the tornado. With the Jim Rose Tavern and Barber Shop undamaged, it seemed a good idea to make the bar a command post. Beer flowed. The group divided into factions of West New Cambria and East New Cambria. They were split on the idea of the tavern being used for emergency operations. Tempers flared. Deputies were called in to tell some residents to stop carrying guns around. One guy wrote "boss" on his hard hat as if that put him in charge. But this Lord of the Flies situation would be over in a few days, and the town suffered little damage from flooding. Salina, which seemed to have escaped any tornado damage beyond sundown or east, did have this small, isolated spot of destruction 1.5 miles from the main tornado. Only these pictures from the emergency management folder are left as a record of this incident. No explanation short of a small tornado makes sense. Straight line winds would not have been so narrow. Looks like a drill bit F1 or 2 damage. A roof lifted from a home and dropped on the roof next door. The city didn't, however, escape the floods, as this neighborhood had a couple of feet of water in some spots when floods returned in October. Basements were taking on water, and this family in southeast Salina was evacuated by boat. Dickinson County just missed the tornadoes, but the flooding struck many areas, including here in Solomon, The Army Corps of Engineers estimated that Kansas's flood damage within the 80,000 acres flooded would reach $12.5 million, and later announced that the flood control reservoirs and dams prevented $341,893,000 in damages during the multiple rounds of heavy rains seen through the fall. The weather of that 70s year continued to be extreme in Kansas and elsewhere, with more flooding rains, more late-year tornadoes, a high plains blizzard, a crippling ice storm, and a heavy, deadly snowstorm at year's end. It just would not let up, even in the areas already hit hard by the tornadoes of early fall. There was no off switch. In Rice County and surrounding areas, farmers and ranchers had been desperately trying to save cattle trapped in flooding. At Rattlesnake Creek, fences had to be cut so that perhaps some cattle could make it to high ground, but calf losses were expected to be high. Meanwhile, Larry Myers was worse off than many farmers, having lost everything he would need to finish grain harvesting and other fall farm work.
After the tornado, it rained 11 inches in this area. I'm too old to get excited about it. I watch, we watch him. We got a cellar, we can get down. She said she wouldn't go down there, but you'll bail down there, I'll guarantee you. And when I had close over here, we got a neighbor over here that has a storm cellar. We got in it a time or two. But you pay more attention to the weather and the storms, but they can pinpoint so much more things the weatherman can than he could back then. I mean, now they've got all this radar and the whole thing. They can about tell you where it is. Back then they didn't. But we pay attention, all the neighbors do. I didn't go. That was Marilyn's end of it. Barb's mom come down. And they took Mom and the kids, Barb, and sent her up to Hubbard's and gave her some clothes because she didn't have anything on but a robe and some kind of shoes. And she got clothes then, and by that time, people had told my folks, and they come over with a pickup. I think she took all of you to Wyndham, if I remember right. I may not be getting it right, but except me and the dog. And we stayed there till dark after, and then we went over to Wyndham. And then she called her folks, and they come down, I think, the next day and looked around, and then they took her and the kids up to her folks, and that's where she stayed. I stayed with the folks at Wyndham. But then I had, when that tornado hit us before it hit here southwest, it killed some cattle I had in the pasture over there. Then it went on across another pasture and killed some more for me, and then it took out 160 acres of milo for me too. Oh yeah. I couldn't do anything to clean up. I didn't have anything. I could walk around and pick things up. But people showed up from Little River, Wyndham, and everywhere else right after that tornado, and they were out there picking things up, saving what they could save. They'd take it home with them and clean it up and keep it for us. But I couldn't do much. They come in with equipment and stuff, and his tractors and loaders started loading junk up, was piled up, loading in trucks and hauling it off. Because the yard was full, you couldn't drive in there hardly. I mean, there was pieces of stuff everywhere, but nothing was standing. Mennonites came and started cleaning up, and then they walked the fields. I mean, other people's fields, the one across the road where the pickup was and stuff. They started walking them and tricking up all the stuff they could find. Of course, you didn't get it all, but they walked across them all the way up through there, through the pastures and everything. And they got up where my Milo was there. They walked that. Man, they did a good job. They hung around. That's what they do, go around and help people around here clean up. And then, but when I went back to work the ground up there where the Milo was, I had 11 flat tires, because, I mean, they're little Buhrs, nails, they didn't see to pick up, you know, when there's stalks of Milo still standing there.
Back in those years, the neighbors was glad to help you.
Yeah, they still do.
Yeah, they still do. That's the nice thing about farmers.
Well, it's way behind, it stayed muddy, but when I finally got to the field, why, neighbors came. I mean, you know, this is the way they work. Neighbors came and worked the ground and brought their drills. Away we went. We got it planted in a decent time. I mean, that's the way neighbors did here farming. Something went wrong with one of them, you all pitched in. And usually one of these fuel guys would provide the diesel fuel, and the women would get something to eat. But that's how we went, and we got it all done.
And there was a lady, she was the principal at Wyndham. His wife went around to the merchants in McPherson and encouraged them to give us things for free. Everybody treated us really nice. So we were lucky. It was almost overwhelming because we had plenty to do, and searching, you know, just going through everything that was given and finding what you needed. And well, the neighborhood had a shower for us, and the churches in town went together and had. I was up at the high school in the gymnasium. People brought in things and you could just go through it and pick out what you thought you could use. But no, after our tornado, I was really afraid of tornadoes for a while. But anymore, I don't know. I'm just old and I had to worry about it so much. If it comes on TV, and it's too late, I just shut it off and go to bed.
As the heavy rain moved into Nebraska and Kansas, Iowa was next to experience that 70s storm in the very early hours of September 26th, with a total of 4 F2 twisters and 1 F1. At midnight, an F2 dropped at the Harlan Airport, giving the Johnson family a brief trailer home flight. The parents and 3 kids were not injured somehow, as the home was lifted and dropped, caving in the front wall. This may have been the Saline County cell again, because at 1 a.m., another cell entered Iowa, which was timed right to be the main cell from Little River, Kansas, and the McClure farm in Nebraska. Winds, which were first described as tornado-like, caused major damage at a farm near Minden. As tornado-like was also the first assessment of the Harlan Airport tornado, the Minden storm very well could have been another F2. At 2:40 a.m., an F2 south of Kanawha traveled a mile, blowing up 2 barns. At 2:40 and 2:45 a.m., 2 more tornadoes touched down 3.5 miles from each other south of Garner, Iowa. The F1 only damaged 2 chicken buildings and a cornfield, but the southerly F2 destroyed a barn, cattle shed, and a hog house, injuring hogs. At 4 a.m., the last Iowa tornado, an F2, destroyed 8 outbuildings and turned large cottonwood trees into kindling, throwing 1 tree through the side of a farmhouse. Finally, as a gray and wet dawn broke over Olmsted County, Minnesota, the last tornado of that 70s storm skipped along a 2-mile path, damaging 3 farms. As it passed over the Arnold Wendt farm barn, Arnold's 19-year-old son became the last to be injured. The F1 blew him right out of the barn. He sustained only a small cut. You might say that tornado came and went. This was 635 miles from the farthest twister in Kansas, the F3 near Englewood. But on Thursday, September 27th, there were encore performances from this dying system. At 3:18 p.m., an F1 spiraled down at the Cherokee County town of Scammon, Kansas, destroying 1 home and damaging a gas station. Funnels were spotted in several counties as thunderstorms became severe again. Over in Bourbon County at 6 p.m., a much stronger F2 touched down just long enough at the Allen-Bourbon County State Lake to destroy several mobile homes. Funnels continued to happen over the next 3 days, and October 3rd brought another one down on this farm in McPherson County, Kansas. This gap in the trees was likely where it passed through and lifted in what would have been corn, sorghum, or soybeans. This heralded the arrival of the next storm system, which once again brought flooding to the area. Around midnight on the 11th, a wide F1 hit Harper, Kansas, spreading damage to roofs, trees, porches, and trailer homes. Much later on the 11th, a strong F2 touched down in southeast Wichita, destroying 25 mobile homes. That one caused 15 injuries. On the 18th, the town of Harper in Harper County had another F1 tornado, which caused total destruction to buildings and trailer homes. At 1 a.m. on October 25th, well into autumn, an F1 damaged roofs 2 miles west of Goddard in Sedgwick County. There seemed to be no off switch from the severe weather, and the tornadic activity went on through November in Kansas and several other states. 8 tornadoes hit Kansas that November, 2 F-Zeros, 5 F1s, and 1 F2. The F-Zeros and 4 of the F1 funnels spun down on the 19th, with the other F1 hitting on the 20th in Washington County. The F2 hit around 2 a.m. on Highway 75 in New Strawn in Coffee County in southeast Kansas, damaging a boat factory and boats, then moved north for a mile, doing outbuilding damage and finishing up by blowing up a barn. There were no injuries in any of these. All of these November storms caused damage along with high straight-line winds and hail. Always hail. As if this wasn't enough to deal with, amongst these strange spring-like twisters, winter kept checking in to add to the chaos.
And then in December we had an ice storm. And we had no electricity for about a week. And with a baby, I had diapers that needed to be washed and no water, because when you live in the country, if the power's off, you don't have any pump to pump the water. And so I just felt like we suffered through the plague, all sorts of plagues that year.
As is the usual pattern with these severe weather systems, the cold air swept in behind the late season tornadoes, starting with a northwest Kansas blizzard on November 20th. Then came December's ice and snowstorm on Tuesday, December 4th, 1973. Following on the heels of more heavy rain showers, a cold front brought this ice storm to the plains, and Clay County was a prime target again, with days of power blackouts for hundreds of residents and farmers. Dairy farmers without power to run heaters or milking operations were the most affected. While iced-over trees and fields made for pretty pictures in other counties, people here were struggling hard with the frozen world around them.
Then we came home to Waterville, Kansas. Coming home, we ran into her folks, came and picked us up. They released her and then came home in an ice storm. I mean, the roads was nothing but ice. And my father-in-law smoked a pipe. He said, I won't let my pipe drive. I'm driving from the lady side over the steering wheel going down the ice road, smoking. He's lighting up his pipe. We got to Waterville, Kansas, where we lived, and the neighbor lady came out and says there's no electricity, and she had a brace on her leg. She says, go work someplace where it's warm. So I had about 1.5 inches of ice on my car doors. I had to break it open, get the ice off so I can get in there started.
On Sunday, December 30th, 1973, nature had one more weather surprise for the year. A killer blizzard. While Clay County was not in the worst of it this time, they did get over 5 inches of snow, blowing into 5-foot drifts.
After that ice storm, we had a lot of heavy snow that winter. January of 74. Yeah, because my dad had a heart attack in January out here in the driveway, and because of snow, he and I were trying to push a car out, and he dropped dead. Which is the way to go. Too early, but it was the way to go. Well, let's say it was an interesting, and then it turns out in July, my uncle, who was an asthmatic, dies. Oh, we just did things up right for a couple, 3 years in a family. Oh, yep, it's... You just meet it and go on.
Over the 24 hours of September 25th, there were 18 confirmed tornadoes in Kansas and 3 in Nebraska, for a total of 21. Of these, there were 2 F0s, 1 F1, 4 F2s, 14 F3s, plus 4 unconfirmed but likely separate tornadoes. The 24-hour total was then 25 tornadoes and quite likely more than that. Added to the 4 in Kansas and 1 in Oklahoma for the 24th, and the total is 30 tornadoes in the first 2 days of the outbreak. Add 6 on the 26th from Iowa and Minnesota, and 2 more in Kansas on September 27th for a total of 38 tornadoes in 4 days. The tornado count in all of Kansas in 1973 is 119, with 56 injuries and 6 deaths from tornadoes, half of those occurring on September 25th. The total number of tornadoes in 1973 for the whole USA from the National Weather Service is 1,102, causing 2,454 injuries and 90 deaths. The worst tornadoes were some F4s, the deadliest in Texas, which killed 7 and destroyed a third of the town of Hubbard, Texas. An F4 killed 5 near Muskogee, Oklahoma, and another killed 5 in Alabama. New York State and Massachusetts had a rare, violent F4 that killed 4 in Berkshire County, Massachusetts on August 28. Damage across the U.S. was in the billions. There was one F5 tornado in 1973. Storm assessment was evolving in the 1970s, with Ted Fujita's F scale starting in 1971. May 24th of 73 brought the Union City Tornado Breakthrough Study when the National Severe Storms Laboratory team filmed its entire life cycle while scanning it with Doppler radar. This was the first capture of the tornado vortex signature, leading to a nationwide deployment of Doppler radars. The NOAA methodology for counting tornadoes for their storm database is done in segments. Tornadoes may contain multiple segments. A tornado that crosses a county line or state line is considered a separate segment. Also, a tornado that lifts off the ground for less than 4 minutes or 2 miles is considered a separate tornado segment. If the tornado lifts off the ground for greater than 4 minutes or 2 miles, it is considered a separate tornado. Thus, the tornado in the Patterson film was considered the same tornado that hit the trailer park, even though it was still roping out when the park was hit less than a mile away. It was a family of tornadoes the whole way, with a tornado on the ground 70% of the path. When the Myers farm was leveled, F4 damage was done. Tornadoes can go through several degrees of intensity, so it was apparently rated F3 from the damage at Little River. The 1972 through 74 El Nino was later suspected of intensifying these 70s storms. 50 years later, in 2023, El Nino was again making storms more intense. The Weather Service records show only one F3 tornado in Saline County on the 25th, though film proves that there was at least one other. These kinds of twister clusters have become more prevalent in the decades since, though there aren't really more tornadoes now than back then. This NOAA study, using data from 1960 through 2013, found that tornadoes are increasingly forming in groups, possibly correlated to climate change. While this does show a definite trend over the past several years, it does not, as yet, prove causation. It does show that tornadoes are forming in more months out of the year. They're also spreading to the east from our traditional tornado alley in the plains.
Climate change is happening. I don't care how many people say it's not. When you live out on a farm in the middle of Kansas, you know that it's happening. You see it happening. When I was a girl going to school, we would have snow drifts 12 foot deep in the roads. There are places that are really water hungry, that have been in droughts for years, and there's no water coming. The the snow caps on the mountains are melting away, and they're not being replaced with snow. It's changing. It's getting warmer, and you just watch thermometers for 3 years. You can see that it's getting warmer. It's getting like it was in the 30s. It got really hot in the 30s, and it's doing that again, I think.
Climate change scares me to death because I think it's happening. And we're helping it happen. And I don't know what we're going to do about it. You have to, I guess the best thing to do is I save my aluminum cans. Do the little things you can do, what you can do, and hope it all helps. Hope some blankety-blinking politicians understand what's going on before we're too late.
Climate change, I think, is a bunch of bunk that somebody just wants to do instead of talking about what's really important.
Climate change. As far as I'm concerned, if they just don't worry too much about, I think most of it'll pretty much take care of itself. Because I think back in the 30s and 40s when the majority of the people were burning coal for heat, and all the soot and the smoke that made, and the air looks pretty clean to me right now. I think it's overdone, overreaction, over too much control myself.
Well, the Defense Department is concerned with sea level rise. Not only their climatologists, but their generals are concerned with sea level rise for a very simple reason. If you look around the world, 70-something% of human beings live pretty darn close to the coast. And there are some countries that are entirely right on the coast. As sea level rises, those folks have got to go somewhere else. In countries like the US, where folks from Miami can go to inland, or even that's going to be a challenge because we have large numbers of people who live near the coast. But imagine a country like Bangladesh. They don't have anywhere to go. Imagine other countries where the coastal population is so large, the inland population can't absorb them. So what that means is that we are creating inadvertently hundreds of millions of climate refugees in the future. And we know now, we've seen enough of what happens when you have tens of thousands of refugees in terms of the turmoil that can be created in those situations. Imagine what hundreds of millions of refugees means. And you can get an idea of why the Pentagon is very concerned about climate change.
So who knows what's going to happen there? But the California drought, I've been seeing that's bad out there right now. But that can be attributed to global warming or other things. But the weather is a lot of crazy things going on that I never saw as a kid. And when I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, we shoveled snow all winter long. And in the 80s and up to now, the last several years, I've shoveled my walk maybe once or twice a year. That's it. And back in the 70s, my gosh, we made lots of money shoveling snow back then. And it's changed a lot around here as far as snowfall. That's really changed. And that could be attributable to global warming, I guess.
One of the problems that come into it is people talk about global climate change. And what is not as clearly communicated is that change will be felt differently around the globe. Some areas may actually experience cooling rather than warming. So one of the studies and one of the advances has been to downsize these global models to a more specific location and how that might be impacted. Another is to recognize that it's not just an annual temperature, it may be shifts in seasonal patterns, and how will that be affected? One of the things that is fairly clearly understood and is generally acknowledged by everyone is that any changes will be most visible at the poles.
I tell people that you live in interesting times, and one of the things to keep your eye on today is Arctic sea ice. So the way our planet has functioned for 10,000 years or longer is that there's the Arctic Ocean is ice covered all winter long and most of the summer. And that white ice reflects the energy back into outer space. As the sun tries to warm up the Arctic, it can't really do it because it's hitting white ice, and that white ice acts like a reflector, sends the energy back to outer space. As the Arctic sea ice melts, white ice is replaced with blue ocean. Blue ocean can really absorb heat energy. And so you change tremendously the energy dynamic of the Arctic when you go from white ice to blue ocean. Now, why hasn't that been a problem in the past? And it hasn't been a problem in the past because the amount of Arctic sea ice, number one, it's abundant, but number two, it's old. It's 5, 6, 7 years old. So it's thick ice. By the way, Arctic sea ice is constantly being flushed out into the North Atlantic. That's what makes icebergs, and it sucked the Titanic and a whole bunch of other things. But as long as it's been cold in the Arctic, this thick ice just keeps reforming. And so you keep ice there. That's important because in any given year, you might have a really warm summer. But if the ice is thick, you can resist that warm summer. The ice will still make it through the summer, and it'll be around for the next summer. We're in a situation now where the majority of the Arctic Ocean is 1 year old ice. It melts back in the summertime and it reforms in the wintertime. And that's a very dangerous situation because if we get a really warm Arctic summer, that means the ice goes. And my analogy to the Great Lakes is that if you look back in the 60s and the 70s, the Great Lakes would freeze over pretty much every winter. But it took very little time for that ice to go away. So Lake Erie, which is about the size of New Jersey, would go from 100% ice covered to 0% ice covered in a matter of a couple of weeks. And for those of you in the viewing audience who have lived in Wisconsin, Maine, other northern areas where you have lakes, you know this. I mean, springtime meltout is this, blossoming event, and it occurs pretty rapidly. So we're in a world now where a rapid flip of energy balance could happen at any given time because the sea ice is in the Arctic is thin. It's really 1 year ice now.
That's kind of a tough question. That, there is a ton of controversy that's out there on it. And I think I look at it from more of a scientific aspect. And there's definitely things that you can't deny that is occurring in our world that is so different than what it was 100 years ago. But there are things that are also consistent when we talk about El Nino or La Nina. I mean, right now we're in a La Nina winter. And how is it that you explain that to Joe Citizen as to what that does to the weather patterns or the weather effects that we have? Because it's all, I still think, as much advances as we've had scientifically when it comes to weather or weather warnings, there's still so much that is completely unknown. And I like to chalk that up to, Mother Nature just has one heck of a secret, and how she does things is how she does things. There's facts and figures that you can put behind everything, but there's still some things that maybe will be a little bit more accurate in things 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road, but I know I won't be alive in 100 years, so we'll leave it up to everybody else to figure out.
As time goes by, we've gotten better and better at understanding our planet, but we're still very much in our infancy when it comes to understanding how the planet functions. I mean, we got some of the basics down, but if you were to say, I need to know how rapidly sea level is going to rise over the next 200 years, decade by decade, we couldn't give you that answer because we don't know enough about the big ice sheets and how they function in order to answer that kind of a detailed question. Is that out of our realm of possibility? No. With enough study, we can give you those kinds of answers. But right now, we can't. We haven't studied it enough.
Well, I think the other thing, and we haven't really talked about this a lot, is what's going on with K through 12 education. Our public schools aren't what they used to be, right? And we have something like 14 states in the nation teaching creationism instead of evolution. I don't know what you think is going to happen. Right? The science curriculum has become politicized in many states. I don't even know. I mean, we're never going to have top scientists, I can tell you that, if that keeps up. I feel fortunate because my kids get a great public education here, but that is not true across this country, and it's not right.
To me, it's you learn more about the Creator as you study the planet. Science and religion, to me, are two sides of the same coin, rather than being totally different, bits and pieces that can't possibly be put together. You can come to different conclusions about God. You can come to different conclusions about how the planet was formed. Fine, we are entitled to our beliefs. Right? We're not entitled to our physics. We're entitled to our beliefs. But I have no trouble as a scientist seeing how all these pieces come together. As a matter of fact, I find it really fascinating. I find it to me, it enriches the conversation. It enriches the topic to think about it in these terms.
I think we need to be careful, but if we are very careful and the rest of the world is blowing stuff into the air, there has to be control elsewhere besides just here.
And that's where it gets very, very scary when people start talking about geoengineering. Because when you talk about geoengineering, in many cases, you are making the assumption that we understand the dynamics of the climate globally to the degree that we can tinker with that without having hugely negative consequences. And something like fertilizing the ocean in a particular area to increase carbon uptake in that region might have unintended consequences in another part of the globe that trigger enormous drought or change in temperature or change in local impacts that were totally unexpected. And again, that's where I caution that we have tried in the past to engineer natural systems with devastating results. And that can go from looking at our flood control on the rivers, where we assumed that we understood and could control them, and discover that we've created unintended consequences in the health of the river and the propensity for very intense floodings when they are channeled into a narrower range than the river's natural course. Another example might be looking at our idea that we could manage the forest systems, and by suppressing fire we could improve the health of the forest. And in reality, we discovered that that had unintended consequences in the natural variability of the forest and its ability to regenerate and to sustain itself. So we don't have a very good record with manipulating natural systems, so it would require an abundance of caution before we did anything with the assumption that we could control what is happening with our climate. I think a better course would be, how can we minimize our footprint on the globe and interfere as little as possible with the natural environment around us and still sustain our way of life.
The planet happens to come with a built-in mechanism by which CO2 is removed from the atmosphere. It's called photosynthesis. And it's not crazy to think that one could grow trees and then bury them in anoxic muds and make that carbon go away for some period of time. It won't go away forever because carbon will eventually leak out, but it's a way to mitigate the problem. It's a way to keep levels of CO2 from rising. So it's In other words, the planet provides us with some interesting mechanisms by which we can engineer the system we're in. We have a lot of debates in the scientific community about how smart it is to do geoengineering, particularly on a planet that you don't understand how everything works. It's sort of like asking me in row 23B to go fix the airplane while we're flying along. It's like, maybe not the best idea,
We see armadillos here in Kansas, in this central Kansas now, we see armadillos. 20 years ago that was unheard of. We are seeing wildlife changes all over the country that can be attributed to nothing other than climate itself. So climate is changing, and that humans are a part of that change, I think is very clear. And I get this from information that is out there. I can't cite facts and figures, but people in the know, people that I respect, can attribute the climate change to human activity. And that activity can take all sorts of forms. People say, well, from livestock, for example, then from humans. Well, indirectly, that's humans. Why are there so many cattle in the United States? It's because of humans. Okay, so it's whether the changes are caused by humans directly, that's only partly true, but because of human activity and that, I think that it's fairly obvious that contributes to a considerable amount to things that are causing changes in climate.
We know that if you add more energy to the atmosphere, some things will change. But something like a hurricane, for example, is a pretty complex phenomenon. It requires not only warmer and warmer oceans, which we have, but it requires the right kind of atmospheric circulation, the right kinds of winds. So for example, a hurricane that flows into an area where you have strong winds aloft, it just chews the top off the hurricane. So hurricanes require not only the energy source, which is a warmer ocean, they require a calm, peaceful atmosphere, and those two things may not go hand in hand. And that's a good example of the complexity of predicting what's going to happen as the planet warms up. It's not a simple thing we know some things are going to happen. We know it's going to get warmer. And we know that because roughly 50% of the energy that's currently coming in from the sun is expressed as what we call sensible heat, or heat that you can feel. And when you get a number that big, you know that, all right, if I add more energy to the atmosphere, it's going to warm up. Right? But other ways in which energy is expressed, through evaporation, through storms, through winds, through photosynthesis, these are smaller parts of the system, and so how much they're going to change under a higher energy world is a harder question. And so when you ask questions like, is this what we expect? The truth is that we don't know exactly what to expect. We do know that some things are going to happen, like sea level's going to rise. That's an easy one. It's going to get warmer. That's an easy one. But then you get into much harder ones. What about wildfires? What about hurricanes? What about tornadoes? Things that people care very much about, but things that are much harder for us to make solid predictions that yes, these are going to increase, or no, they're not going to increase.
I'm sure that all the people on this earth have changed the way the climate is. I'm sure that the emissions that we put out are having something to do with that. I don't know how much or what we can do to correct that, but it's a little bit hard if one country does it and the other one doesn't, so it really defeats its purpose.
there's a hard truth here, and that is that if you add up the coal, oil, and natural gas that exists on the planet, and we've burned roughly half of the oil and natural gas already, it is more carbon than in all of the existing living plants by roughly a factor of 3. So in other words, you would need you'd need 2 more planets of plants to make to use plants as the sole mechanism by which you're going to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so scale, this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have as earth scientists when we talk to the general public, is scale, is the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas we take out of the ground is really jaw-dropping in its size. And so any effort that we put into mitigating that, in other words, removing it, has also got to be jaw-dropping. I happen to be an optimist, and I'm also a big fan of human beings. I think we're really clever creatures. And when we put our mind to something, we can do something. What is interesting about the climate challenge is we haven't decided to put our mind to it. We still are in a mode of thinking, nah, it's not a problem. And then the scientific community knows there's a problem, and there's a good chunk of the population that knows there's a problem. But there's enough of the population that shrugs it off, and there's certainly a large number of our leaders who shrug it off, that we're not doing anything about it.
There's quite a bit that falls under the auspices of emergency management. And I like to tell people, name it, we have our hands in it. It's pretty amazing when you start really opening the Pandora's box of emergency management. People think of just the disasters that happen, the floods, the fires, the tornadoes, the winter storms. And it's so much more than that, because it's those planning for stuff like that. It is bringing people together to the table and discussing, hey, how are we going to do this? What resources do we have on hand before something happens? It is exercising, bringing people to the table and actually going through the motions and pretending like there's an emergency or disaster, just to see how everything's going to play out. There's the grant funding piece of it. There's a lot of grants out there to help and assist with numerous things, but you kind of have to be a little resident expert to know how to get those grants. The public speaking piece of it, the preparedness piece of it, going out and actually interacting with the public and teaching our community how to be prepared. The more prepared our community is, the more resilient we are going to be towards disasters. I tell everybody that my job is really to be very knowledgeable in a lot of things, but an expert in nothing, but know who those experts are and have their phone number in my back pocket. So that's my emergency management in a nutshell definition.
Refugees, that's all we were refugees that night. And my dad had an old fat tire bicycle with a big fat seat on it, and that's what we called the restroom runner. And that's how we got around town running errands, was that bicycle. But to see what the physics were, it was just it's hard to talk about, because you go to tell them and you know nobody's going to believe what you saw. But as we were allowed back into town, there were funny things would happen, or you would see stuff that was just abnormal, or somebody would say, well, hell, did you see the skid marks on the side of the elevator? I said, what are you talking about? He said, hell, there's rubber marks on the side of the elevator and a bumper on top, and there's a vehicle behind it. Well, that explains the water tower, why it was crumbled and squished. And just to think, where did the 55,000 gallons of water, if it was full at the time, shot out? I mean, squish a full can of soda pop and see where it goes. Somebody got a hell of a bath that night, and their basement washed out because that water had to go somewhere. And then we started hearing about the EF5, and then it started coming together about why they rated this tornado, was why Dennis McKinney's pickup was cut in half and the two pieces were a mile apart. And why the 40-barrel oil-filled tank that was 7 miles southwest of town ended up behind Schmidt's house on Main Street. And it didn't look like a tank. It looked like it was, a bowling ball by the time it came to Greensburg. There was no wall standing with the front veneer brick. But the guns that were in the very southwest corner of the house, in the gun cabinet my brother made in high school, I found them that night lodged in a wall on the opposite end of the house in the exact same order that they were in the gun cabinet. Couldn't find the gun cabinet, but the guns were lobbed through sheetrock and the barrels were all bent, all in the same order that they would have been in the gun cabinet. So the physical things that happen, it's hard to really digest. But what's also hard to digest was to see all the vultures and the buzzards that followed the path of the storm in huge flocks, because Mother Nature is part of the ecosystem. After a disaster, birds are looking for dead animals, especially if you're a carnivore. For the mental health aspect of recovering from PTSD, whether it be a man-made disaster or something from Mother Nature, it's all about positive mindset. And if you look at where we're at in the world today with climate change, are we being good stewards to Mother Nature in our ways that we should be, let alone the human race? Because for what's happening with these supercell storms and what's happening with these mass shootings and man-made disasters, the manuals to recover from those things, the ink's pretty wet yet. And there's not a lot of stability in what to do and what not to do. And you always hear someone from the outside say, "Suck it up, Buttercup." That's life.
I think the biggest thing that I can tell people is that there's a reason as to why it is that we ask you to be prepared. And it's because we don't have the resources to help absolutely everyone when something happens. It's going to take us a little while. So the more prepared that you can be personally, at home, or even at work, or even your children understanding how important it is to be prepared, the more resilient we are as a community, and the quicker we're going to be able to recover from something that happens here. That's the biggest thing. The myths of it's not going to happen here, it's not going to happen to me, and if it does happen, the government's going to take care of it, are strictly that. They're all myths. It's not truth. And realizing that is something that's hard to swallow sometimes.
And Secretariat has won the Triple Crown!
We're heading for the triple point, 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 triple point. I happen to think that those things are rather positive in the sense that all three of those moral issues, if you will, are really ways in which we as human beings can grow as a species. I think it's important for us to think about climate change not just in a physics sense, which I think is important obviously, but to think about it in the human sense. And I don't think it's fair that we are living it up on fossil fuels and then handing our kids and our grandkids a problem. I don't think that's fair. I think we need to think more about our kids and our grandkids. And I think when we do that, if we think more about our kids and our grandkids, we're thinking more in terms of what the planet says you got to think on this time frame. The planet tells us, if you're not thinking on the 50-year time frame, you're not doing it right. And I think it's a wonderful built-in system here, right? So, do you care about your kids? I hope so. Do you care about your grandkids? I hope so. But if you really do, then you got to start thinking about how the planet functions on that kind of time scale. We talk a lot about population. Demographers tell us that there are very good ways to deal with population growth. You don't have to have, the approach the Chinese took in the past, where you just boom, you get one kid and that's it. If you empower women, both politically and economically, they have fewer children per woman, and they have them later in life. Both of those things end up controlling population. So, ironically, the key to population growth control is really one of men sharing power, both economically and politically, with women. In other words, the old paradigm in which males dominate around the world has led to a fundamental population problem. And the sooner we understand that and recognize that, the sooner we men learn to share power with women, the sooner we will be able to get population under control. The third piece that I talk about is one of what we call wealth equity. That's what I was saying earlier, that if you have 2 billion people on the planet who can't afford to care about what energy they use, in other words, they can't afford to care about climate change, you're not going to solve the problem. If 5 billion of us shift over to different kinds of energy, or 5 billion of us capture all the carbon that we produce and sequester it, and 2 billion don't, we've not solved the problem. Because when you have that many people still producing greenhouse gases, you're going to have a problem. You got to view this as we're all in it together.
I just want to make the world better.
I just think about my kids and go one step at a time. If I can make that first step, I'm all right. But it takes a lot of guts sometimes to make that first step.
I think God is in control, ultimately. Even the things that we consider crisis situations and bad situations and horrible situations, He can turn into good.
Yeah, you get numb. Just look at what all you done, because in that house we'd worked it over. I'd sanded the full floors, refinished them all.
If I say a little prayer or repeat something that is more meaningful, my mind suddenly is fixed on that rather than the hardship. And that does bring me peace.
It's just feeling a part of something bigger than yourself that can thrill you and inspire you and also destroy you.
No, I don't see this as part of any grand plan at all. I think it's just the way the chips fall.
I definitely am a Christian person. I believe in Jesus Christ, and I think that He does have a place and a direction for us.
I don't belong to a church.
Oh.
And then He saved me again from the tornado, which could have killed me and the 3 kids at that moment. And He's preserved me. I'm here for a reason. I'm here to give and to share and to help others.
I'm a born-again Christian. Me and my wife both are. We joined church in 2009, and that's been a good thing for us.
Devastation is going to happen no matter what. There's nothing we can do to control it, but what can we do to remedy it and make it less traumatic for the people that have gone through it?
I've got a religion, but I'm not a fanatic.
most of the times you don't have to look very far to find someone that's got it worse than you do. Just keep that in mind.
When you can help somebody, it makes you feel good and you can thrive off of it.
You're right. I agree with you 100% on that one.
You're talking to an atheist here. I don't know that you're going to get much. Other than I think that's just the way it is. I mean, that's the way this earth was put together.
I think it's all created by God. It's in God's master plan, and it's not for us to know. It's for God to know. It's all in His plan.
You talk about it. You know, if you find someone who can listen, you talk about it. I think that means a lot. You know, to kind of get it off your chest.
God knows what you're doing. He knows you're sitting here asking us a question.
Except she's planning on going to hell and I'm not. Shovel that coal.
All right, well, I won't say what I was going to say.
I think every family has times when they have things that happen that you're not planning on, you know, and if you know the Lord, it does make a lot of difference, you know.
Faith and the people over there that go to the church with you just help you. I mean, if you need help, they're there. If you need a few words of encouragement, they're there. If you lose a loved one, they're there.
Yeah, and I think people tend to think it's all, that there's somebody up there protecting them, and so it's all going to be okay. This is all bull, and it's all going to be okay in the end. And I'm not sure I believe that. So yeah, I worry too about not me, but my grandkids and great-grandkids.
You know, don't get me wrong. I'm not in church every Sunday. We go quite often, but I'm not there every Sunday. I'm not the thumper, but I do believe that He has a situation for me, and I had lots and lots of good people praying for me when I was going through chemotherapy.
And there's a point where science and spirituality meet, and to me that's the holy grail of understanding life, that between the distance of facts and figures and emotion and spirituality, that's where truth lies. And I really believe that.
Scared to death. As a kid, I think I was probably afraid. Scared to death.
And it was so close and so scary,
very scary
to be that close to it.
I think everybody was afraid.
Children started screaming.
Afraid to stop, afraid to go.
I've always had a big fear of tornadoes.
Yeah, I remember being very scared.
I was really afraid of tornadoes.
I worry about my grandchildren in this world.
Climate change scares me to death.
We did not choose to have this storm. We didn't plan this to make anybody mad at us. But to see a spike in senior citizens die after the tornado due to mental anguish is something that I believe that is caused from depression, is caused from mindset, and I think people can determine if they feel bad enough that it's an easier way out is just to pray to God to let me die tonight, that you can possibly do that, because we saw a spike in mental anguish deaths, in my opinion, and we have had 5 suicides related to the tornado in the first 10 years. I think that's very normal. I think it's very common that people think of that. It's not talked about enough. It's not prevented enough, in my opinion. But mental health is extremely important in daily routine if you're in a natural disaster, and if you're not. That's what life is being a positive attitude. And some people have always said, how can you keep your chin up? Well, if I tripped over my lip, I wouldn't get very far. what kind of experiences can I start sharing from the Greensburg recovery process and what we did as a community, because we just didn't rebuild this community by ourselves. You know, we can officially say approximately 25,000 volunteers came to Greensburg. The religious organizations played a big factor with the volunteer, with the rebuilding of Greensburg. I always say that if it wasn't for religion, we wouldn't be here today. And when you become the volunteer coordinator after a natural disaster like this, like I tell people, the tornado did not stop and throw out a manual and say, good luck with the rebuilding process. You shot from the hip a lot, but living in a government-issued trailer house is probably not the most desirable thing that anybody really want to do in their life, but it was the first new house I ever had, so I was happy. And they come with pots and pans and everything. But there was still this deer in the headlight look with so many people around town on decision making, and you know, the case management workers from the long-term recovery people were trying to get the programs all put together, and I noticed that there was families that were making decisions that were very wrong, and some, of course, people were making good decisions and some people were making bad decisions. Some relationships went south, some substance abuse came back, some people fell off the wagon, some people got on the wagon. You know, it's just life. It's, you got to deal with it and go forward. But there was still that internal part of me that said, why is this happening? And am I a part of this? And if so, how am I going to correct it or learn more about it? So the Iroquois Mental Health Center offered a first aid mental health class. I'd say about the 5th year after the tornado. And I said, I'm taking this 2-day class. And it was the most interesting class that I'd ever participated in as a student, but then also as a breakout session participant with other people. And I immediately thanked the staff for putting it on, and Sheldon Carpenter at the time, that I was very unaware of the services that were provided by such a great organization that was sitting right here in Greensburg, Kansas, and it should have been utilized immediately more after the tornado than what it was. After taking this, the class for mental health first aid, you know, I didn't take a magic marker and put sergeant stripes on my arms or anything like that when I went into a disaster to go help talk to somebody, because it's always, listening's your best medicine there is for anything. It just made me more aware of the importance of sharing what you've been through to make a common ground with someone else so that you can build a relationship. And at this time I had just started traveling a little bit more and more around the country to various disaster sites, visiting with survivors, visiting with family members who had lost loved ones, such as Sandy Hook, Mena, Arkansas, Iowa, just various parts around the country where you would visit with people who had been through the same thing that you'd been through, that you saw this common fabric of conversation. And by taking this mental health first aid class, it helped me personally, and it also helped me talk to other people that before I knew it, I was giving advice on a very non-professional basis, but it was just coming from the heart.
I believe we'd have a better world if we'd all go within, deal with our issues, heal our wounds, cleanse our souls. We'd have a different world. Happiness is an inside job, not out around us. And so many of the things we try to do, like greed, power, ego, all those things become so important to so many because there's still a wounded child within. And until they do the work to clean that out, then things are not going to change, I don't think. We all have to deal with our stuff, and we all have stuff to deal with. That's my message.
Some people are never going to deal with their stuff. We have to deal with them.
Well, I think then we have to look at how we deal with them. Firm compassion. We have to have consequences, yes. We also have compassion because they are wounded souls, whether or not we want to recognize that or not. And sometimes it's very, 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 very hard, particularly when we look at our political situation today. It's hard for me to have compassion for you-know-who, Mr. T, but I think his issue started long ago. That's my belief. For what it's worth, peace is the answer.
The Wizard of Oz. Yeah. Tornado, Kansas, and Toto. I know. And everybody, we still to this day get ribbed about, Toto and Dorothy and, click your red slippers and yeah. There's more to Kansas than flying monkeys and scarecrows and tin men. Definitely. It's a cool movie.
The Golden Road and all that, Yeah. Did you ever see that movie, honey?
No.
Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz, yes.
We actually had one of the casts that had a house in Washington.
Still lit. Is
Still there.
But he's dead now.
Yeah.
The midget had a house in Washington.
I like the way it starts out in black and white, and then when she goes into her dreamland, it's all color, and then when reality comes back, it's black and white. So why didn't reality stay color for her? You know what I'm saying?
The yellow brick road. I don't know where the yellow brick road is, but we have red bricks in our town, Little River, but
That was unique. And it had a lot of different characters, and they represented different things, and that was special and informative, I think, for kids to watch. It wasn't terribly fearful, but it gave them an insight into a lot of things, I thought.
Well, The Wizard of Oz, of course, and the tornado in that was fascinating. And that's one of the things, I guess, when I would have been about 7 years old, when we watched that on television. And we watched it every year when it was on television in black and white. And of course it has color. But that tornado, that was one of the most fascinating things I ever saw. And that's what drew me to watch the storms. That was one of the things right there that had me become a big interest in tornadoes and storms.
It has a lot to do with life. I mean, you could be a coward, but you can be also a lion, and no longer a coward. Or you can be a tin man and you squeak when you walk. You can be, the scarecrow. I mean, it has a lot to do with life issues, I think.
but the midget actually lived there, the male midget.
She survived and came back, if that's
if that's, I don't know if that was the message or not.
We go to Arizona and they'll all say, how's Dorothy doing? And my answer is, I really don't know her very well. That usually stops it.
Oh, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto, is just the common expression from that movie. And it's just fine with me. I just don't particularly want the crowds to come to Kansas. I like Kansas the way it is. It's a great state, and the people are independent and good people, and we just don't need to just clutter it up with a lot of buildings and people that probably don't belong here. Maybe that's bad.
It was a good movie. I'm sure if we had the money it made, we'd be doing all right, wouldn't we?
You know, it scared the crap out of me the first time I saw that movie. I had nightmares, I won't lie to you. And I remember it.
I did not, when it came out, I did not like the movie when it came out.
Well, they helped each other. Each one had something that they lacked, and they leaned on the other, and they found self-worth and help with the Tin Man and all of them. There was a purpose for them, and they felt needed.
The Wizard of Oz is Sam Brownback, who's screwing Kansas from one end to the other.
I just watched it with you kids when I had to. When I was home.
I can't remember either, but yeah.
He's dead now, because I remember I typed his obituary up, but I can't remember his name.
Not much of a movie fan.
It was a little bit scary to me at the time, you know. It was just a little bit far-fetched. I still don't like the movie today.
Yeah, my oldest daughter, I'll sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow to her, back when she was little especially, and she just hated to hear that song. She just hated it. And she would yell at me and she would cry.
I think you see what you want to see in it. As a little kid, the monkeys and the old witches scared me half to death.
All Dorothy wanted to do was get back home to Kansas. What better statement on what a great place to live than that?
I don't think much of Kansas adopting the Wizard of Oz as something to build up Kansas with, because I don't think it ever did. But if it keeps people out of Kansas because they think it's flat, gray, and full of tornadoes, power to them. Don't come. Don't come. Stay away from Kansas, and we'll be very happy.
It is amazing how other people, it's all they associate Kansas with is slippers and Toto and Dorothy and
tornadoes.
Tornadoes.
Well, we have our share.
Passing out candy from the museum, and I went down for about 15 minutes, and somebody said, "Which witch are you?" And I said, "I'm the Wicked Witch of the West." I don't like blood and guts, but I like to have fun.
Well, they wanted us to buy that house of the midget had and promote it. And,
like they call them small people.
Well, anyway, I am going to get old, but I am never gonna grow up.
I can't always get up as fast as I'd like to, but I'll turn around and crawl up.
Judy Garland.
And Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
Yeah.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home. Yeah, it's a good movie.
It is, but yeah. Back home again with her dog.
Growing up in Kansas, you have a different take on the film The Wizard of Oz. As a child, I was fascinated by it. They show it every spring. They probably still show it every spring in this area, mainly because that's tornado season, I think. But that's when they always showed it, and that was the first realistic fake tornado that I ever saw, I think. That was a big contraption that they had made in a big sound stage, and it was just a really well-made tornado for film. But as far as the film, you know, it might seem nitpicky, but every reference to Kansas has the Wizard of Oz in it. That's about all people know about Kansas. Some writer or some screenwriter will be talking about Kansas and they'll put in a line, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto. Or what are some of the others? I don't know. I think maybe I blocked them out of my mind intentionally, but The Wizard of Oz has gotten way more play than it deserves. It was an okay film, you know, they made it in 1939. I mean, how long ago? You know, we're going on a century now. And that's still what we're associated with. You know, some people will say, well, that's good for Kansas, you know. It's a nice image to think about home, you know. How can you argue with that? Well, you can't argue with that, but what you can argue with is cliches. And there's been a lot of films made since then, including about Kansas. So I think it's time to put Dorothy to bed. One of the ways we can do that is fight art with art. That's one of my favorite concepts. If somebody makes some art, and you make some art to respond to it. Well, I wrote a little song about this, and I think I'm going to play you this song that I wrote about the Wizard of Oz.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where you're gonna end up when you're dead. You can't click your heels together to get you where you go. And there ain't no fairy tales like the ones we tell ourselves. So Dorothy, go to hell. Lions, tigers, and bears, and lawyers, drunkards, thieves, and pimps, restless people in the poppies, caged up wingless chimps. Your house got blown away, scattered where it fell. So Dorothy, go to hell. This ain't where Toto went. This ain't city streets, in stinky reservoirs, and hateful culture laws, while the house is burning laws. Somewhere under the rainbow on the interstate, them yellow bricks are hard to find, about a century late. You've watched them crumble in the tornado's well. So Dorothy, please go to hell. I love you, Dorothy, but please go to hell. I wish you well. I wish you well, I do.
Bye-bye, Dorothy. Bye. Bye, Dorothy. Bye.
And that's all I have to report for September 27th,
Cut!
1973, at about 15 after 4. Signing off.
Everything just went plumb nuts.
I hate the hockey stick slide.
Oh, good.
That's gonna come down.
Breathe.
This is the exciting part of the interview.
I tell you, it's...
I don't know. Can you be an overachiever? I mean, you're just achieving what you're achieving. It's not my fault if other people feel inadequate. I can't be blamed for that.
This is my county cell phone.
That's a flip phone?
Yeah, this is my county cell phone.
That's all you believe.
Yep. So, if that gives you any indication on some of the challenges we have with using technology.